Hello and welcome back. This mini lesson is covering the brain stem. So we are starting in our regions of the brain and going to talk about the major functions, structures and functions that happen within those four major regions. So if you remember, there's the brain stem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So those are the four topics we're going to be covering when we take a look at the structure and function of the brain. So this first one is brain stem. And so if you remember, the brain stem includes the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. So you have this diagram in your text. It's really busy and overwhelming at first. I don't necessarily want you to memorize all of the leader lines on all three of these or four of these diagrams, but use this more as like a guide map or a reference point. So when you're talking or learning about the medulla, you can come back and say, oh, here's how the medulla is related to these other parts of the brainstem. Here's how the medulla is related to the cranial nerves, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. Or how does the midbrain sit, or how is the midbrain in relationship to the thalamus or the pons? Because there's going to be so many anatomical things you're going to be learning with the brain, it's really important that you kind of get your roadmap. And so think of these really kind of labeled pictures as your roadmap. So what is the relationship between the medulla and the pons and the midbrain, and the midbrain and the thalamus and the midbrain, and kind of use it as a reference. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say. Don't memorize it, use it as a reference. And what I like about what your book has done is they've color-coded these things. So throughout all of the pictures in the diagrams of the brain, they're all color-coded. Now, in a real brain, obviously that's not the case. You might see different shades or textures here and there, but it's kind of brownish grayish. You'll see that in the sheep brain dissection in lab. So these color diagrams kind of help you in the learning process. And then eventually, the goal should be, could you label a black and white picture without needing the colors to be able to give you clues? Start building that relational, this is my landmark bump. I know this is the superior colliculus, no matter what picture I look at, and then kind of branch away from there. Where are the other structures that are associated with that particular landmark? So you'll start learning those landmarks and then start branching out and seeing what can be remembered based on your understanding of those landmarks. And eventually the goal is you'll be able to label any brain part from any picture or any diagram or any model, because that should be your ultimate goal. It's going to take a while to get there, but by practice and repetition, you'll do it. Okay, so let's go through this roadmap real quick. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because it's not where all the details are. So the medulla is the orange part. So we're seeing a lateral view, an anterior view, and a posterior view, and then a posterior view with an actual cadaver brain. So again, remember the medulla is continuous with the spinal cord. So they're showing, nerve roots of the spinal cord. So that's something that we learned back in chapter 13. You're also seeing, kind of branching off of the medulla, are some cranial nerves. And the last mini lesson in this series is going to talk about cranial nerves, which you'll be working on in lab and memorizing those as well. So we're going to talk about the cranial nerves associated with each part of the brainstem as we go into the different pieces. The pons is the blue, or kind of the bluish green, that sits on top of the medulla, which is going to be connected, the pons is connected to the cerebellum. And then we have the last part of the brainstem is the midbrain, that's the green. For some reason, it reminds me of celery, so I always call the midbrain the celery stalks, right? Because does not kind of look like celery, like a ribbed celery stalk? I don't know. And then sitting on top of that, which is its own part, so this is not part of the brainstem, but they're just showing it in relation, is the diencephalon. That's kind of the pinkish mauve color. So what we're going to focus on in this video are just these three parts of the brainstem. We're going to start with the medulla, then we'll talk about the pons and the midbrain, and that will bring us, that will fulfill this video. So if you need to flip back to this as I'm talking specifically about each one of those regions, that's totally fine. You'll have your book with you. I've also made these little MRI scans of an actual human brain, and I've highlighted the region we're talking about in yellow. So again, it's giving you that relational understanding of where what we're talking about is in relationship to all of the rest of the parts of the brain, which I think is really important. So it's less likely that you'll get overwhelmed with all of these parts and pieces if you kind of know their place, if you know where their general location is in the brain. So as I've indicated here, the brain stem is right there, sitting on top of the spinal cord, right, with the cerebellum here, the diencephalon here, and the cerebrum here. So this is what we're going to spend some time talking about right now. All right, so here is that reference picture, and we're going to zoom in. We're looking at just the medulla oblongata, and again, here's my little MRI picture over here. You can see I've just highlighted the bottommost part of the brainstem. So when we take a look at the medulla, we are going to break it up into its white matter and gray matter, and then there's some terms that go with that. So we've already talked about tracts back in the spinal cord. Tracts are basically like nerves, but in the brain and spinal cord in the CNS. So bundles of axons we call nerves in the periphery, like your sciatic nerve, your brachial nerve, your ulnar nerve. But when we're talking about that in the brain and spinal cord, we don't have the same organization. We don't have the neuriums. We don't have a fascicle. We don't have like a rope-like structure. They're just all embedded within the brain or the spinal cord. So we call these the tracts. So the white matter in your medulla are just the continuations of those ascending and descending tracts that are continuous with the spinal cord. The gray matter are what we call nuclei. So in the peripheral nervous system, a collection of cell bodies, we call it ganglia, right? So that's spinal ganglia, dorsal root ganglia, or the chain ganglia, sympathetic ganglia. Those are collections of cell bodies outside of the spinal cord in the peripheral nervous system. Now that we're inside, I said spinal cord, the CNS, outside of the central nervous system. Inside of the central nervous system, when you have a collection of cell bodies that are doing similar functions, we call this a nuclei. So in the spinal cord, we also call them nuclei, right? So we have the nuclei of somatic sensory and visceral sensory in the dorsal horn. We had the lateral gray horn was the visceral motor nuclei. The anterior gray horn was our somatic motor nuclei. So we've seen that word before, so hopefully that's kind of cementing more of your understanding. Nuclei are collections of cell bodies that typically do a similar function. They're functioning the same. So let's take a look at some of the gray matter. We have these groups of nuclei. We have autonomic nuclei controlling visceral reflexes. Okay, so these are going to be like your visceral reflexes. So it's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. So cardiac vasculature, so cardiovascular center, sorry, so that's going to be regulating your heart rate, your blood pressure, those types of things. Respiratory rhythmicity center. And while I do know that the diaphragm and your intercostal muscles are skeletal, they do have some control in the visceral realm, even though you can override that for a bit. Once you hold your breath long enough, you will pass out, and then your autonomic system will kick in and start controlling your diaphragm and intercostals for you. So this is our visceral reflexes center. We have the cranial nerve nuclei. So when we take a look at our cranial nerve list, these Roman numerals will make sense to you, but cranial nerves number 8, 9, 10, and 11, and 12, parts of 11 and 12, those are all going to be nuclei, so they're cell bodies processing this cranial nerve information will be located there in the medulla. And lastly, we have relay stations. So relaying is kind of how the name implies. Information will be kind of passed from one circuit or neuronal pool to the other. So usually when we're talking about a relay center, there's going to be synapses. So that's where cell bodies are going to be located because that's where you synapse onto the dendrites in the cell bodies. So some of these relay stations are the nucleus gracilis, the cuneatus, and the olivary. So these nuclei do lots of different things. So I just have a little kind of description here. So the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus are somatic sensory pathways up to the thalamus. So they are going to be relaying information that's coming up from your spinal cord of somatic sensory information. The olivary, that's called the olivary because I guess early anatomists thought they look like olives. So I guess they look like olives. They relay somatic motor information towards your cerebellum. So somatic motor is your olivary. And then solitary nuclei receive and relay visceral sensory. So we had the other nuclei for somatic sensory, and now we have the solitary nuclei for visceral sensory. All right, so then here's another, relay stations, autonomic centers. They put that solitary nucleus in there with the visceral sensory as well. Okay. Something else that you'll see in this diagram is the reticular formation. I'm not going to talk about that yet because we're going to call that headquartered in the midbrain. So I'm going to address it in the midbrain, but do know that it does penetrate all the way down into the medulla. All right, so there's our discussion of the medulla, kind of the functions of the white matter and the gray matter. Now we're going to take a look at the pons. So again, we just got done looking at the medulla. We can see the olive there, the olivary nuclei, the reticular formation, that big long orange wormy thing. So now we're going to take a look at the pons. Again, here is our reference picture. So we're moving up our brainstem, and then here's the diagram of the MRI. So the pons is a nice bump. It's an anterior feature. So to me, the pons is a really easy landmark. So once I can find the pons, and I can find the pons in any picture, I know that the mesencephalon is just above it and the medulla is just below it. So that helps me locate where I'm at and give me a landmark to then start branching out to see my other things. All right, so in the pons, we do have some cranial nerve nuclei associated with that. It's not shown on this picture, but it would be on that reference picture. You can go back. So cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 are associated with the pons. We have nuclei involved in respiratory. So these are important because we're going to see those again in the respiratory system in 233 coming up in the spring. So pneumotaxic and apneustic. Sometimes they're called the pontic centers of regulation of your breathing, your rate and your depth. So those are associated nuclei, again, collections of cell bodies located in the pons. And then we also have relay stations connected to the cerebellum and our ascending and descending tracts. We can see continuous with the medulla, which was continuous with the spinal cord. So the pons doesn't have a lot of stuff going on with it. It's just kind of a relay station and an intermediary. These guys right here, these are called peduncles. We're going to take a look at those when we talk about the cerebellum next. But they are they are closely connected to the pons. But we'll see those in the cerebellum conversation. Okay, that's it. So the pons isn't too busy. Moving on up to the midbrain or mesencephalon. So again, here is our reference picture, sitting right above the pons. I'm looking at this bigger picture here as a posterior view of the pons, kind of showing you some of the gray matter, the nuclei of what's going on here. So we have one collection of nuclei. This guy here, the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. These bumps here, I'm going to erase right there. So those 4 bumps. We have 2 superior colliculus and we have 2 inferior colliculus. Again, those are also really good landmarks because they're really obvious. Those 4 bumps on the back side of the brain sitting just above the cerebellum. Those are what we call the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora means body. Quad means 4. I think that's spelling it right. Yeah. Corpora quadrigemina is a body of 4 bodies. So that might be helpful in you remembering it. So they each have their own, well, not each, but the superior colliculus has their own function, and it is responsible for visual reflexes. So we just got done talking about reflexes in chapter 13. But if you have ever had to flinch because something was, flying at your face, the superior colliculus had a role in that flinching action, right? So you see this visual stimuli and you don't have time to think about what it is. Is it a bird? Is it a ball? Is it a fist? Is it, what's flying at your face? So you just kind of flinch before recognizing what it is. So you don't have to use your cerebrum and your conscious processing. The superior colliculus is doing that for you in that reflex action. So this is visual reflex. Okay. Your inferior colliculus does a similar thing, but with auditory stimuli. So there could be a loud sound like a car backfire or a scream or a screech or some kind of loud sound that's you're unprepared for. And then typically you will look towards the sound. That's a reflex action. You don't necessarily think about it because that loud sound could mean danger and you want to not be in danger. So the inferior colliculus is auditory reflexes. There we go. So the corporal quadrigemina is a major reflex center divided into the superior for visual reflexes, the inferior for auditory reflexes. So that's a good landmark, and it's a nice kind of straightforward collection of functions in that nuclei, the corporal quadrigemina. Okay. We also have what's called a red nucleus located here. The red nucleus is red because it has a high collection of blood vessels, so the dark redness of the actual blood. It allows for unconscious, so below conscious level, motor commands that affect upper arm position and muscle tone. So if you are standing upright and you have a nice tone and you're not like drooping your shoulders, that is your red nucleus is sending these subconscious signals to help maintain your muscle tone and position of your arms, kind of at your shoulder level. All right, the next nuclei we have is called the substantia nigra. Black substance is basically what that means. So substantia nigra helps to regulate activities in your basal nuclei. Now you don't know what basal nuclei is, so we're going to have to put a pin in that and come back because we will talk about basal nuclei when we get to the cerebrum. So just kind of hold on to that thought. Basal nuclei and substantia nigra work together. So we're going to talk more about that in the cerebrum. Okay, and then here we have our ciliary stalks. These are called our cerebral peduncles. This is primarily the white matter, which is your ascending and descending tracts. It's just called a peduncle because it's a fun word. No, I don't know the meaning of the root of peduncle, but there it is. We have cerebral peduncles are going to be bringing the ascending information up to the diencephalon and cerebrum and sending the descending information down towards your cerebellum and pons and medulla and spinal cord. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about is this orange wormy thing that we saw traveling all the way from the medulla to the pons, and it is headquartered here. The very top of it is headquartered in the mesencephalon, and this is called the RAS, reticular activating system. Its function is dealing with your circadian rhythms or your day-night cycles. So it has nuclei that then extend and neurons that extend all the way down through your brainstem to help set your rhythm for being a diurnal organism. We are awake during the day, we are asleep during the night, and so it helps to regulate your levels of consciousness and unconsciousness. So remember our reverberating circuit of neuronal pools. The RAS, the reticular activating system, which is part of the reticular formation, plays a part in setting and breaking those reverberating circuits for consciousness, awake and sleep cycles. Okay. All right, that is our midbrain, and I think I have another picture. Yes. So here is our MRI picture showing you where the midbrain sits, right above that big ball of the pons, and then some cadaver images, so we can see a transverse section and then a posterior view. So here's our corporal quadrigemina, right, the 4 bumps, which is really nice. There's that substantia nigra. We can see it black. So that's kind of where the name came from, black substance. If you're early anatomists, you can see that. The red nucleus, we can kind of see the reddish. I know that's a preserved specimen, so it's probably not as red as you would see in a non-preserved specimen. And then also what we'll notice is the cerebral aqueduct. So if you remember, the cerebral aqueduct connected, so I'm going to draw over here, right there. So the third ventricle is right here, your lateral ventricles are right here, fourth ventricle is right here. So the cerebral aqueduct travels right through the middle of your midbrain. That's why it's sometimes called the aqueduct of the midbrain, or mesencephalic aqueduct. All right, so that wraps up our brainstem discussion. So medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain are all part of the brainstem. All right, our next video will be on the cerebellum. I'll see you then. Bye.